Will Yemen be divided into two countries again? Separatists backed by the United Arab Emirates declare self-rule in the south and a state of emergency. What does that mean for efforts to end Yemen's civil war? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. Yemen's complex civil war has been going on for 6 years. It's aggravated decades-long divisions between North and South. They joined to form one country in 1990, but it's been an uneasy union. Now, secessionists in the South say they're going to govern alone. There were celebrations in Aden as the Southern Transitional Council declared self-rule and a state of emergency. The STC took over the southern port city last year after accusing the government of President Rabbu Mansour Hadi of mismanagement and corruption.
We are
now in front of the Yemeni central bank in Aden after it was taken back by the southern forces led by the Southern Transitional Council, like the other vital infrastructure in the city. We hope this will be a real breakthrough that will be repeated in all the other liberated southern regions.
Last week, floods and torrential rains hit Aden hard. At least 21 people were killed. The STC says the government failed to respond to the emergency. Nationwide, 14 million Yemenis are on the verge of famine. President Hadi says the declaration of self-rule is catastrophic and dangerous. North and South Yemen were once independent states. The North became a republic in 1962. South Yemen was established 5 years later. They united in 1990, but tensions endured. 4 years later, the South tried but failed to secede. Now they're trying again, after 5 years of war started by a Saudi Arabia-UAE coalition that's tried to prop up the internationally recognised Yemeni government. It had lost control of the capital Sana'a to Iran-backed Houthi fighters, and AlKhadher and ISIL were staging attacks. The Southern Transitional Council was set up in 2017. It's backed by the UAE. It's supposed to be part of a power-sharing deal with Yemen's government. That now seems dead in the water. Let's bring in our guests. In New York, we have AlKhadher Sulaiman. He's the director of the Foreign Affairs Office of the Southern Transitional Council. In London, Elisabeth Kendall, Senior Research Fellow at Pembroke College at the University of Oxford. And in Singapore, Abdullah Baabood. He's a visiting professor for the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. Thank you all for joining us. Elisabeth, if I can start with you, why has this declaration come now, do you think?
Well, Bernard, I think the timing is significant. Now, of course, it's true that the grievances of the South go back decades, and the concept of Yemen as a single country is actually very awkward. Yes, it united, not until 1990, but already within 4 years it was at war. So the grievances go back a long way. But I do think that picking this moment to announce self-administration is significant because all eyes were on the ceasefire that Saudi was trying to broker between the government and the Houthis. And at the same time, of course, the world's attention is on fighting the virus and what devastation that might cause in Yemen. And people are pretty much on holiday because it's Ramadan, it's the start of Ramadan. And all eyes of humanitarian organisations are on the floods that have devastated Yemen over the last couple of weeks. So really, this is a moment when no one was looking too much at the South. The Riyadh agreement hadn't worked out, that was signed between the North and the South. And so this was the moment to pick to announce what were long-standing grievances, to solve those, to actually declare, finally, self-administration.
Abdullah, do you think the STC has timed this well?
Well, I think they've been building up towards it, Bernard. They've refused just recently a flight of the legitimate government leaders to come to Aden, and they have not implemented the Riyadh agreement, as it were, and they've been building up to it. And I think they chose this moment because the world attention, as Elisabeth correctly said, is focused somewhere else at the moment. But the event itself was inevitable. It was just a matter of time and a matter of when. And I think they chose this as the right time. Now, knowing that the world attention is, with COVID-19 and there is obviously the ceasefire that is going on in Yemen. There's also some kind of a dialogue going on between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis at one level. So I think the timing from their perspective is quite good, but at the same time, the decision itself could have some very important ramification in the future.
So, AlKhadher, is that what the STC has done then? It's chosen this moment to put the wheels in motion to see Yemen's again split between two separate countries, a North and a South Yemen. Is that what you want to come from this?
Well, that's not the reason why this moment was chosen. As a matter of fact, Elisabeth touched up on the humanitarian aspect very well, and the grievances in the South that led up to this situation. This is a pile-up. The humanitarian situation is dire and only worsening. There are clear and present danger of the coronavirus outbreak in the South with a possible devastating impact. And the humanitarian crisis is only worsening with the recent April 21st flash floods.
So, AlKhadher,
that was deadly.
So you found yourself in a good position to set yourselves up to push for a separate country, South Yemen.
No, that isn't true. The STC prioritizes the well-being of the people. People are frustrated, and the grievances have built up. There's an accumulation of all these grievances. The government has been negligent in providing basic services, and now, as your guests have mentioned, it's Ramadan. It's Ramadan. It's there's the outbreak threat. There is these flash floods. All these aspects, and the humanitarian situation is also only worsening because there's no basic services being delivered. Now, electricity, sanitation, drinking water, even facilitating aid or civil servant salaries. This is not due to lack of capacity. Unfortunately, the government is implementing a collective punishment for the southern people. It's only the STC was compelled to intervene for the sake of the people and not for political gains or to capitalize on a dire or opportunity that some people want to picture us as trying to do.
Elisabeth, could the STC have done this without a nod from the UAE?
That's very unclear at the moment, Bernard. I think what we can say is that, yes, the grievances of the South, currently mainly represented by the STC, are there. They're genuine. They've existed for a long time. But they've been helped along by support from the UAE, who did originally fund the creation of the STC in 2017 and at the same time recruit military forces across the South, which answer essentially, despite the Riyadh agreement, still to the STC. So it's difficult to see how the STC could move without the say-so of the UAE, but of course we can't be sure.
And Abdullah, the UAE has strategic interests in that part of the world, port access, particularly down there. Does what the STC have done cloud the UAE's ambitions, or will it have given some sort of nod for this to go ahead?
Well, the UAE sees its interest in Yemen, especially in South Yemen and Bab el-Mandeb and the strait there, as part of its strategic, if you like, depth in the region. And obviously, the announcement also came, which is quite odd. It came from Abu Dhabi, where the head of the STC was apparently there. And it would have been difficult for the STC to announce this without the nod, without some kind of a green light from the UAE. The UAE has always had a strategic interest in Yemen and Aden in particular, and some of its ports. The question is, what kind of interest does it have, and to what extent does it conflate or conflict with the Saudi interest? This is something that is very difficult to tell, because the two sides in the coalition are still not clear. And despite all what we see as sometimes conflicting interests, there has been no signs from both of them criticizing the other for one reason or the other. So I think the Saudis have their own interest, obviously, in Yemen, and the Emiratis have their own interest in Yemen. And at some point, this interest has got to kind of conflict rather than conflate, and there may be a problem at that stage. But I don't think the STC would have done it without the nudge from the United Arab Emirates in this case. I don't know what Saudi Arabia's position is, but obviously there is an Emirati green light.
AlKhadher, the STC, has benefited from UAE support, financial and militarily. You didn't go ahead with this without approval from the UAE, did you?
Well, the UAE actually supports anyone in Yemen in general who is fighting the Iranian-backed Houthis or conducting counterterrorism. It just so happens that the southern forces, led by Aydrus al-Zubaydi, have been most efficient in these in both fields. That does not necessarily mean that the STC is a UAE project. Now, the STC actually came out of the southern movement grievances that were calls for over 2 decades. The UAE involvement that we're talking about here is roughly 3 to 4 years, or going on for 4 years, regarding the support of the
and it's
southern
in those 3 or 4
forces.
years that you've really that your cause has really benefited from UAE support, isn't it?
Well, the cause, as in regional and international security issues such as counterterrorism and the fight on the Iranian-backed Houthis, yes, we have definitely benefited in that sense. And there are calls that have been there for over 2 decades, such as from the Southern movement that gave birth to the Southern Resistance, which then gave birth to a political entity that is a genuine representative of the Southern people, which is the Southern Transitional Council. Now, the UAE role in this is positive. It has actually helped in many humanitarian fields. It also has helped in the fight on terrorism. The Southern Transitional Council, in the end, prioritizes the people or the demands of the people, regardless of what the coalition at times feel needs to be done. The STC will prioritize the demands of the people, and that's going from basic services to a genuine, inclusive representation or negotiation peace process.
Okay, and Elisabeth, would the Houthis support what's going on in the south there? Would they be interested to see a more independent-minded southern part of Yemen? Does that help them?
I think what the Houthis will be keen to see is this rift re-emerging in the coalition. It was clear that the Riyadh agreement signed between the Hadi government and the STC in November really just kicked the can down the road. It didn't solve anything. It didn't solve the issue of southern secession, and it put in place a whole load of promises and timelines that haven't been kept. No doubt that this benefits the Houthis because it makes the coalition far less strong in fighting them. Would the Houthis, though, actually want a separate secessionist southern state? That's a lot less clear, because even though that would put them in charge, or at least in control of most of the north, really the resources are in the south. The major port revenues, the cottage industries that work, like fisheries, etc., and most importantly, the oil and the gas. So in the short term, the Houthis are probably quite pleased about this. In the long term, much less clear.
Abdullah, what do you think about that? The Houthis' long-term interest, would they be willing to stomach some sort of more independent state in the south of Yemen?
Well, I would agree with Liz in this case that the Houthis see any kind of conflict within the coalition. It serves their best interest, at least in the short term. And obviously this does to quite a large extent. But I think the Houthis have always considered Yemen as a unified country, and they always wanted to rule Yemen as a whole. And I don't see it, in the long term as working for their interest. But I think certainly for the short to medium term, it is. And I think they realize this, and this is why they are really pushing forward towards Marib to control the oil fields there. And I think they have almost sensed from their negotiations with the Saudi Arabia that that they could really reach in some kind of a settlement between them, and no aggression between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia in one sense. And to a certain extent, they would probably let go of their ambitions in rolling over the whole country, as long as they can get their hands on the oil field. And I think this is what their kind of medium or short-term to medium-term strategy is.
AlKhadher, you haven't carried all of the south of Yemen with you. You're not supported by every governorate. When you say you're speaking on behalf of the people of southern Yemen, you're not speaking on behalf of all of them, are you?
Well, I don't think there's any entity probably to this day that actually represents 100% of any nation. There's the entities that have a vast majority, such as the Southern Transitional Council, that has a vast majority of support by the people. And due to failed institutions, the only way that we can actually measure this support is through the million-person protests that the STC continues to bring out. Or that continues to come out in support for the STC, rather. I want to touch up on the ceasefire that Elisabeth mentioned. The Southern Transitional Council is adhering to all the Security General's calls, the Riyadh calls, the Special Envoy's calls. As a matter of fact, President Zubaydi was the first to call for a ceasefire before they have called for it, so that we can battle this pandemic properly. As for the Riyadh agreement, the Southern Transitional Council has implemented the major points on the Riyadh agreement, while the legitimate government has actually walked away from it, and in fact actually done the opposite of implementing some of these points. Now, the STC allowed the Prime Minister to return. They've provided full access to the military sites. They've facilitated detainee exchange. They've even withdrew military forces. Now, if there's a spoiler in this, it would be the Hadi government, unfortunately, who has not implemented the Riyadh agreement, nor are they looking for any political settlement in the near future.
All right. Elisabeth, are we heading a long way down the road, but do you see this eventually ending up with another independent South Yemen, a Republic of South Yemen or whatever, the two places, Yemen splitting into two? Ultimately?
I think what we do know is that Yemen as one single entity is problematic. But I don't necessarily think that means that Yemen as two entities, North and South, is going to solve all the problems. In fact, when the South did eventually cohere at the end of the 1960s, even then it was not consensual across the governorates that were incorporated into that. So the South is not necessarily a popular concept across the South even. So what I think we might have eventually is Yemen split into further parts, which might become federal regions. But I think you made a very good point, Bernard, in saying that it's not clear that the STC represents even those who do support a separate South inside the South. Surely it's the loudest voice, and I agree with AlKhadher. There were millions on the streets in support of it. But already today, we've had declarations by the governors of Hadramaut, of Shabwa, of Al-Mahra, southern governorates who've said, no, we're not on board with the Southern Transitional Council. And all right, you could say that those governors were appointed by President Hadi. But it's not at all clear that in those eastern governorates, there's support for the STC or for a breakaway South.
Abdullah, help us understand where we are then at the relationship with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. At the very, very top, both leaders get on well. But what's happening here? Because Saudi Arabia has been looking for a way out. The UAE is essentially pulled its own troops out of Yemen. What's going on between these two countries, and how will that affect what the STC has done?
It's Pandora's box, Bernard, if I may say so. It's very difficult to tell because, as you correctly pointed out, that at the top there is a very strong relationship going on between the two leaders, and the two countries as well are coordinating in so many different things. They have also created a coordinating unit in political and economic and social issues, headed by the crown princes in both countries. And they seem to be working towards more cooperation, more integration in many aspects. Yet we see that they have some kind of conflicting objectives and conflicting visions, particularly in Yemen, but also in other areas. And the UAE withdrawal was quite a striking moment to consider in this relationship. And now what is going on with the UAE supporting the South separatists, as it were, or the STC, goes against the objectives of the coalition itself, which is headed by Saudi Arabia, which entered the war for a unified Yemen. And of course, talking about Yemen separating and whether the South has grievances, I think this is all known. And it's just a matter of time where the two sides will separate. It's just a matter of how, when, and how, and in what proportion. So it seems that the UAE is pushing this with the STC that does not have that, if you like, support within most of South Yemen as well. And it's also playing into the hands of the Houthis and playing into and strengthening them in so many ways, because there is going to be conflict in the South, and the coalition will going to be much more occupied in this southern conflict, and forgetting the main objective that the peninsula, the war in Yemen has actually started for. Okay. So I think it is a very confusing picture, and it's very difficult to judge what's going on.
And quickly from you, Elisabeth, what do you think Saudi Arabia is going to do now? It doesn't want to see the Houthis strengthened along its southern border.
No, I think Saudi Arabia actually is quite keen to get out of Yemen now, and that's probably why it's offered a unilateral ceasefire. Houthis were on the front foot, actually. So they haven't agreed to the ceasefire, but now we've seen Saudi Arabia extend it for a further month. I think they'll try to pull back. I think both parties, actually, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, are probably pretty war-weary. And with this massive drop in the oil price, it's expensive financially, militarily, in terms of international credibility and reputation. I think they're going to step back.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for today, but thank you very much for taking the time to join us. Thanks to AlKhadher Sulaiman, Elisabeth Kendall and Abdullah Baabood. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And there's more debate on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AH AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Bernard Smith, and the whole team here, bye for now.